Please welcome our next panel, Andya Chakava, Claire Connellan, Ashley Orbach, and Lara Walters. This session will be moderated by Veronica Chow.
Good afternoon, everyone. So terrific to be here. So it's harder and harder these days to find a good news story, but if there's one that I'm really inspired by, it's the conviction that I'm hearing from business leaders and investors alike that now is the time to focus on the S in ESG, these social topics. And the questions that I hear from my clients leading our sustainable finance and social impact work at BCG is evolving from should we address the S to how should we? How do we address these systemic factors that create human rights risks and abuses in our supply chains? How can we better invest in human capital in our businesses? So to answer these questions, I've joined by a fabulous panel who can bring a diverse array of the types of solutions that we need to move fast and move further on these issues. We have Andya Chakava, who's going to describe how finance can really be that force for good. We have Ashley Orbach, who's the Director of Innovation and Environment with Apple, who's innovating actual concrete ways to address these issues in supply chains. We have Claire Connellan, who is one of the go-to people. She's a partner at Case & White to understand the legal implications and how businesses should navigate the increasingly complex legal arena. And finally, we have Lara Walters, who is at the forefront of pioneering new types of legislation here in the EU that are driving not just disclosures, but actually getting to the core of how companies do business. And what I'm excited about with this panel is, as you can see, we have finance, industry, law, regulation, and we can explore not just how each of these pathways can drive change on the social topics, but indeed how each of these can work together to get to that systemic change that we need. So let's dive in. My first question for all of you is why this topic and why now? Why should CEOs stay focused on this S? CEOs that I speak with are facing unprecedented global market volatility, rising interest rates. We're on the verge of a recession. They're looking at discretionary budgets. So why should they stay the course or even raise their level of ambition on this S? Anyone want to dive in? Yeah, Ashley.
Sure, I'm happy to take that on. First of all, just thank you so much for having us on the panel. This is really incredible to sit with this group of women. And thank you to Thomson Reuters Foundation. We've been a close partner of TRF since we were honored enough to receive the Trust Award in 2019 and have been partnering ever since. So thank you for their incredible leadership in this space. So just to answer your question, I mean, I think for us, it's an easy answer. We believe business should be a force for good. And we also believe that we are showing that a business can do well and also do good for people and the planet. So when we look at these issues, we put people first in everything we do. And I can just give a couple concrete examples of that, if that's helpful. First of all, carbon neutrality by 2030. We've already achieved this for our own corporate operations, and now the opportunity is in the supply chain. We have already over 200 of our manufacturing suppliers running on renewable energy, and we are not going to stop anytime soon because the climate can obviously not wait. Second of all, we have a commitment to use only recyclable materials and renewable in all of our products. Last year, we had over 20% of recycled content across Apple product lines, and this is a goal that we continue to drive very hard, which obviously has quite a connection to carbon neutrality as well. And then thirdly, we are investing in the people in our supply chain. I know we'll talk a little bit more about sort of labor and human rights and environmental standards, but we have also really doubled down. Last year, we made a $50 million commitment to individuals in our supply chain, both to ensure rights awareness, but also skill development and training for the jobs of tomorrow.
Terrific. Yes, sure, Claire.
And my thanks also to the Thomson Reuters Foundation. I think this event is really inspiring. It's great to be part of it. To focus on your question, why should the C-suite think about the social issues now? As the lawyer on the panel, I think it's a lot about the changing legislation and greater calls for corporate accountability. Whichever jurisdiction, whichever sector a company is in, they're seeing rapid legislative changes. We carried out a pro bono research project with the Thomson Reuters Foundation and a number of others as a part of a working group. Big picture, 60% of all of the legislation we looked at has been passed in the last 5 years, and nearly 17% just in the last 18 months. The legislative landscape is changing really rapidly, which is requiring C-suite to really focus on where risks to people as well as risks to the business may lie. And that's happening at a national level, and it's also happening at regional levels as well. And I think where the C-suite can really set the tone from the top, that's the best way to take the steps to mitigate the risks that can arise in the business operations and in their supply chain.
Sure.
So I would like to add, so one of the measures of assessing a company is its shareholder value. And a lot of times people have been looking at companies and judging them by the quality of the people they've attracted on their boards or basically their share price. But increasingly, that is being influenced by how that company engages with other aspects, which is the community, whether their products and services are helpful and add value to improve lives, or whether they actually have a staff culture that supports and basically encourages values like kindness. And I say this because I come from a continent where there are not very many very tight regulations in terms of how companies behave. So you basically rely on the sort of moral values and the social understanding of the people that are leading those companies. And we've seen companies that have pursued selfish agendas, whether it is treating vendors badly. We had companies that would take 90 days to pay farmers, and the farmers' lives were basically up in disarray, and they were using that money for other things. Ultimately, that company ended up being bankrupt because the money they could have used to pay farmers, they were basically embezzling. So what I want to say is that there's a sign in how people treat the community around them, and if a company behaves in an extractive manner, then it also shows that the company doesn't have a long-term view. So as investors, we're widening our breadth to not only look at kind of the profits and revenue a company is generating, but the experience of all the users around that particular company.
Mm-hmm. Great. Lara.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me. I think your answer was, why do we need to talk about the S in ESG and why does it need to be done now? And I think the simple answer is because it's the right thing to do, even if it's difficult and even if we're going through war and inflation and a lack of purchasing power and staffing issues everywhere. It's the right thing to do, and it'll never be a good time to do something that is difficult and takes a long time. But maybe to spice things up a little bit here, also given that we're coming to the end of the program, I think, we heard a story from Apple at the beginning saying, you know, we see it as our mission to do the right thing, and I don't buy that. And I'm saying that for the sake of this panel as well. I think that it's good to have a discussion here, but the reason that we're making legislation on this is that I think there's a huge amount of confusion out there. And I think I'm not the only one going, wait, I'm reading in the newspaper about Apple having problems with sourcing from certain mines and issues going on there. I'm hearing that there's people who haven't been paid in India. I'm hearing that there's problems even with food supplies to workers in hostels. So how do those tie up with what I've just heard? And I think that confusion is something that we need clarity on, I think for the sake of consumers, for the sake of investors. And I see it as my job to go and bring some of that clarity. And I think one of the big issues is When we talk about ESG, I think there's confusion on what it is we mean, and I'm going to borrow from Stuart Kirk here to make things even more controversial. For those who don't know him, he was the banker who was fired from HSBC because he said, "I don't believe in ESG." That's not really what he said, but what he says is there's confusion on whether ESG is an input or an output thing, and with input meaning whether it's something that that investors, for instance, business people need to take on board, need to take into account when thinking about their business model, when thinking about returns on investment, or whether it's an output thing, whether it's something that we all need to be striving for. And I think that those are two very different things, and I get very confused when companies say, no, it's an output thing, my whole business now is about doing the right thing, and also maybe selling iPads. I think we need clarity there, and I think that businesses ought to, in the 21st century, be sustainable businesses, but that's not a PR issue, that's something that needs to be felt throughout the company in a serious way, and that's why we're making legislation in the EU.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful question. I'm happy. I'm happy to clarify, at least from the perspective of where I come from in the business, which is in our global operations team. So we care as much about how products are made as the products we make. And the way we do that is we have a global supply chain. We have a very strict supplier code of conduct, which covers, probably touches about 3 million people. So we have both the responsibility and the opportunity to operate in a responsible manner that not only doesn't do harm, but also does good. And so just concretely how that works is we have a human rights policy which governs Apple employees, the supply chain, communities in which we either operate or our products may touch. And then we have, within that, a couple other policies. The one that I work on is our supplier code of conduct, which is quite strict. It deals with labor, human rights, environmental standards. And we conduct, there's a number of tools by which we use to ensure that our suppliers, who are all required to meet our code, are able to do so. Firstly, we carry out, with obviously third parties, assessments or audits. Audits are necessary, but not sufficient, but they are a snapshot in time, which allows us to look at about 500 points of criteria as to how a supplier is operating in these particular areas. What it also allows us to do is it provides headlights to really see what do we need to do to capability build with our supplier. Ultimately, if suppliers are unwilling or unable to meet our strict standards, they will be removed from the supply chain, and we publish those statistics yearly. But the preference is to partner with our suppliers, which we think is ultimately better for the planet, for instance. If we're moving all of our suppliers to renewable energy, ensuring that there is rights attainment at all of the supplier sites. Our standards are global. They don't change in a country where we operate. And then on top of that, we have additional education programs and other things we do in the supply chain, which I'm happy to talk about. And then finally, I would just mention, kind of at deeper levels in the supply chain, you mentioned material sourcing, mineral sourcing, which is really critical. For us, that's a very deep, we don't buy raw materials. But that doesn't matter, because it is our responsibility to ensure that our standards are being met very broadly throughout our global supply chain and deeply to where labor may be recruited from, to where minerals may be sourced from. And in those circumstances where there may be sourcing very far away from where production sits or where we sit, we partner with local groups. And that includes ensuring that there's independent civil society. So we'll work with Thomson Reuters Foundation. We partner very closely with the IOM, with the ILO on ensuring that the standards are met, but also that environmental and human rights defenders have the ability to speak up. And we do that in a way that, of course, we don't influence those groups, but we work with organizations like TRF, the Global Fund for Human Rights, who do have the ability to work with local groups.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Ashley. Laura, I might come back to you. Regulation is a key theme, and you are working on regulation that moves from disclosures to actual behavior change. So could you comment a little bit more on the legislation that you're drafting?
Yeah. That legislation basically says that companies, when doing business, need to respect human rights and that they need to have respect for the environment. So what we're talking about is a duty of care, and that's a proactive duty. As was said before, no matter where in your supply chains there might be problems, you might be doing harm or there might be potential harm. No matter where that is, you need to go and you need to see what you can do about it. And it's a duty of care that will try to ensure accountability, that will try to ensure responsibility, and no longer the situation of people pointing to each other and companies looking away. And to clarify, that means also that it's absolutely fine to say, look, what we do is we make iPads, but we make iPads and we do that in a way that at the end of the day respects human rights and the environment. And so it's not about companies taking over the roles of states or the duties of states. I think it's states' duties to protect human rights, to go and actively protect the environment, protect minorities and so forth. For us, it's enough if companies respect those rights, but respecting those rights is something that's hugely important. And of course, not always simple when we're talking about hugely complex value chains that go to the other side of the world. Mm-hmm. And the reason that we're doing that is that I think we're realizing that an economy that is built on lowest common denominator, or an economy that is built on doing business in authoritarian regimes or doing business in places with low labor standards or low wages, that at the end of the day, apart from not being right, at least when you zoom in locally, there's a lot to be desired, but also because we've realized that ultimately that's not a sustainable model for our economy.
Mm-hmm. And I want to pick up on this supply chain topic. Claire, question to you. A lot of this legislation is targeting the larger publicly listed companies. Can you comment on how some of the elements of that, be it third-party certifications, other contractual elements, will start to ripple through and therefore have implications for mid-market and privately held companies as well?
Yes, so it's true. Most of the legislation so far is really the very largest companies. In France, about 250 companies are caught by the French duty of vigilance legislation. The Norwegian Transparency Act has different criteria again. That's about 9,000 companies. In Germany, 3,000 employees in the first year. But I think the impact will go way beyond these very large companies in three main ways. The first is through contractual cascading. The contractual assurances that the largest companies will seek from their suppliers. We heard some examples of that, requiring the smaller companies with whom they work to sign up to their codes of conduct, to third-party standards. The second is through financial and technical input. I think the larger companies will be required to provide financial and technical support to smaller companies. They're likely to have the resources. You already see some examples of that without it being mandated. And the third is around market opportunity. There will be limits for smaller companies to sell in different marketplaces if they haven't met certain international norms and standards. You see that, for example, with the London Metals Exchange, with their responsible sourcing. Brands won't be able to sell unless they will be able to verify certain standards of conduct. So there are these different ways that I think you'll see the larger companies that are in scope of the legislation influencing the smaller companies which aren't directly in scope. But finally, I think that the direction of travel is actually through the lowering of the thresholds. I mentioned the German corporate supply chain due diligence requirements. That starts off with a threshold of companies with 3,000 employees. Within a year, that will drop to 1,000 employees. So the direction of travel is actually I think, increasing the number of companies who will be caught by the legislation.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating, fascinating. India, you acknowledge that the markets you operate in might not have as much of this legislation happening, but in our chat before this, you said in those markets, it's even more important for investors to be asking the hard questions on human rights, on social topics, and in your experience, they aren't. So what questions should they be asking?
Yeah, so in the investment community, it's also very, should I say, there's a debate amongst the community, because there's the ones that have the impact investing hat, and then there are sort of concessional investors, and they're pure commercial investors. And it's almost as if everybody has different motivations. When you see a company move its plant from basically a northern country to a developing country, they're after sort of cheaper labor. They're after lighter regulations. And you find that investors are not asking those companies, holding them to account in terms of what is actually happening on the ground. And I think it's important here because of this tension of impact and return that we have in our market. Is like when you chase impact, you sacrifice return. And what we are saying, and doing it through the fund that we are raising on, is that you can get impact and return, but we will do impact first, and then the return will follow. And it's still something that we have to share time and time again. I just want to discuss an area with a country in East Africa that doesn't have a minimum wage law. And when a minimum wage in my country is about $130 a month. And a big textile sort of firms went to this neighboring country because they didn't even have that minimum amount. So they went there with the intention of basically paying very low rates. We don't talk about minimum wage anymore. We talk about a living wage. In a society that has sort of a lot of domestic support, these are the most vulnerable, and when COVID came, it exposed a lot of inequality. So from an impact investing point of view, we're basically driving the discourse of we have to have the data first. We have to look amongst ourselves and say, how can we do better? And how can we continue to improve over time? And investors need to include it as part of a pre-due diligence. We have some of the biggest pension funds in the world that are deploying capital, but they've left all of the decision-making to consultants, to gatekeepers that may not necessarily be asking these questions. So to us that are on the ground, we are not thinking about the legislation. We're just seeing what we see and saying the companies like it because they're actually spending less money.
Yeah, and actually your teams are also on the ground really trying to innovate ways to uphold human rights standards up and down the supply chain. Are there some really concrete ways and innovations that you're bringing to life?
Sure. I mean, I think the whole theme and what we've been talking about the last 2 days really is this intersection of environmental rights and human rights. And it is very clear for us that environmental rights are human rights. And we have to look at all of our environmental programs through a human rights lens, and we have to look at our human rights programs through an environmental lens. And this includes all of the standards that we drive in our supply chain. We have thousands of Apple employees at supplier sites on a daily basis. And then deeper in the supply chain, as I was saying, we partner with organizations who might be in those countries where we don't have a presence. So one thing that we've done, and I know we've been talking a lot about just transition, and I've really appreciated the conversations in the last 2 days, is we have something called a Racial Equality and Justice Initiative, and we have been looking very carefully at the fact that poorer communities, and often Black and brown communities, have been disproportionately affected by climate change. And do no harm is fine. But we just don't think that is good enough. And so we have really been looking at what can we do, what is our role to ensure that communities can actually benefit from the transition to renewable resources. One way we're doing that is we have something called a Climate Justice Impact Accelerator, which started in the United States. We're on our second cohort of businesses, and we run businesses, Black and Brown-owned businesses, through an accelerator. These are companies that are working on climate solutions that are practical, and we believe we can assist in helping ensure that they're able to receive business, scale that business, and so that's one thing that we've been doing. I know we could talk forever about innovation. Obviously, this is something that is very near and dear to our hearts, but there's a lot of innovation in the material space as well. Sometimes we've had to partner to invent recyclable materials. I'll give you just one example, rare earths. Rare earths is a critical mineral. For a long time, it was sort of understood that rare earths couldn't be recycled. That is not true. We have recycled rare earths, and we have rare earths in our product lines. So it takes partnering, and it also takes deep innovation to ensure that we're accelerating all of the work that needs to get done.
Terrific. I'd like to open up another question for dialogue. So we're talking a lot about supply chains amidst a backdrop where supply chains themselves are under unprecedented disruption due to the pandemic, now recent geopolitical concerns, not to mention climate with border tax adjustments, et cetera. So in your perspective, will these disruptions either help or hinder efforts to drive human rights improvements through supply chains?
Both, I would say. I'm just going to go in there because
yes,
you're looking
good.
around. And,
yes.
I would say both. And
yes.
I think that I'd like to say, look, COVID is making it so clear that we need robust supply chains and that you need to know your supply chains. And then if COVID happens again or another pandemic, then we'll be so much better off. And the war in Russia Russia's war, I should say, has shown that, doing business with authoritarian regimes, that it teaches us a lesson and that it's hugely disruptive. And all those things are very, very true, and I mean them. Mm-hmm. But I also think that we've been in la-la land a little bit over the past years. Yes. And I think we're catching up the hard way now. I think that there was relative geopolitical stability. There wasn't the inflation that we're seeing now. I think that stock markets were doing very well and maybe people were falling asleep a little bit. And I think that all those things maybe made us forget that the model that we're building our economy on, i.e. it's not a coincidence that we go to low-wage countries, etc. It's not a coincidence that we do business with Russia because gas is cheaper there. I think that now we're seeing, well, actually, that was a huge, big mistake, and saying we need to go and fix that. But I think that the reality for businesses, and others here will know better, is probably that in the short term right now, the problem is how do I keep my staff, how do I pay the energy bills, how do I even get through the current crisis? Mm-hmm. And I'd love to hear people say, well, no, the current crisis is making us work even harder on all of these things, but I'm guessing right now we're between a rock and a hard place, and all the things that we should have done much, much sooner are being served to us.
Mm. Others on this end, yeah.
I think the current crisis has also had people benefit of sorts from the desperation that workers have felt. So we had one of our telco companies basically release a product that allowed people to access overdraft funds. And this was sort of instant cash. And immediately, this became the go-to place that everybody was getting their source of financing. And I think it added like more than 20 or 30% to their bottom line. But what it ended up doing was creating this cycle of poverty and dependency on people basically living in the cycle of debt that they themselves couldn't afford, and astronomical charges going up to daily interest rates of between 1% and 5% for amounts that are not paid. It took the incoming of our new sort of administration, government administration to get those charges reduced. So it's not as if the companies themselves were aware that the pricing was exorbitant. They just saw a gap in desperation and saw that this is a product that we can basically make some money on. So what am I saying? I'm saying that even as investors, as we see lucrative returns, I think we have to also dig deeper and say, how are those returns being made, and what is the premise? Is the premise that people are in a cycle of poverty? Is the premise that people get put on a credit reference bureau because they can't pay $20? So I think we need to see who also has exploited this crisis to sort of provide products to the most vulnerable, products that maybe should be more concessional, but are using it to make lucrative returns.
Anyone else on this theme?
I think there's a continuous tension between short-term and long-term that companies have to grapple with. And the crises in the last couple of years have, in some ways, I agree, some ways helped and some ways hindered. Sometimes can act as a catalyst for accelerating the changes that are needed, but always with a view to the longer term as well.
When I talk with business leaders, one of the things that they are mindful of as they raise their ambitions on the S is the increased scrutiny and the term social washing that they might be exposed to. So again, from each of your different roles, investor, lawyer, legislator, corporate, who's leading the way, any advice that you would offer for how can companies show up and do this authentically and not be subject to that kind of social washing claim?
I can start. I mean, I think we would say, do the work. Roll up your sleeves and do the work, whether that is mapping your supply chain, ensuring that you have the right standards in place, driving those standards very hard, not being satisfied with the status quo ever, ensuring that it's part of your company value system, that it's led from the top, that is clear, that that is part of your company DNA. And then I think that you have to be transparent and talk about the things that are sometimes hard for companies to talk about. So we do believe that transparency in reporting is important. So, for us, for instance, we have a supply chain report, which is, we're an incredibly data-driven company. And so we tend to report out in data. For us, the data tells the story. And so we try to tell that story, and it's not always the perfect story that a company wants to tell, but we think that unless you address these problems in a collective manner, we can't seek to change the problems that we want to solve together. So, in addition to an ESG report, which we have, and a supply chain report, and an environmental report, which are all incredibly data-rich, we publish a list of our suppliers, which represents 98% of our corporate spend for direct manufacturing and materials. And we publish the list, we say where the suppliers are located, and then we, further down the chain, we also, because there's been a lot of interest, we also publish minerals processors, or smelters and refiners, if you want to get technical about it. Many companies in the United States are regulated to publish their smelter and refiner lists for certain materials like tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. We go further. We publish our cobalt refiners. We publish our lithium refiners. And we try to be transparent. And I think that for us is what we have found the most important way to drive this. And then we hear from stakeholders. We hear what we're doing well, and most importantly, we hear what we're not doing well. And that is the thing that we try to focus on.
Great. Maybe Claire on this topic of social washing.
Yeah, so social washing, sometimes also called blue washing. Sometimes you hear rainbow washing with reference to the SDGs. There is greater scrutiny from the regulatory perspective on all of the statements that are being made. And just as an example, the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK has published a green claims code, which is guidance for avoiding greenwashing. I think it's mostly common sense, but it's a useful checklist for the statements that are being made. Any statement needs to be truthful, accurate, fair, unambiguous, mustn't hide or omit any information, needs to be fully substantiated, and should address the full life cycle of a product. And if you can work through that as a checklist, I think you'll avoid the allegations and potential liability associated with greenwashing, blue washing, rainbow washing.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to add that I think that the members of the public are really good at fact-checking politicians. And I would just like to encourage more investigative journalism when it comes to corporates and how they behave. And being also aware of what happens in developing countries as well, where a lot of people claim. So there's a big fund, and to them, the fact that they're just investing in Africa makes them an impact investor. No, it doesn't. You have to do more than just deploy capital to a continent. You have to basically look and see. So if you're funding an infrastructure project, but all the plum jobs are with expatriates, have you really done, have you transferred knowledge? Have you basically created some kind of wealth? So these are all these things that we need to ask. I think we need to avoid quick wins. Most of the times when we're talking about these issues, people keep looking for case studies. There's this desire of let's tell a story. I think we need to say that this is hard work. It takes a long time to achieve the particular impact. Let's encourage people to share progress reports where they are and allow people and celebrate them when they do. I remember just one of the companies was talking about just how difficult it was to get women within their supply chain because it was a very male-dominated field. And when they looked at the volumes and they looked at the amounts, they actually said, this is going to be like a 10-year play for us. And this is what we plan to do in 5 years. And I actually believed them because I felt that they were not trying to rush on how they were going to solve the problem. So I think to avoid our social washing and greenwashing, let's also make sure it's not just a marketing play. It's not something we're putting on our annual report to create a perception that we're doing better. But especially if we're raising funding on that basis and that funding doesn't get audited, then I also have to ask the funders of the funding on what are they checking as the actual data points that this impact is happening.
Fantastic. And Laura, final word on this topic.
Yeah, I think we could talk about this all day, but I think your initial question was what do we do against social washing, and I think it was said what you need to do is do serious due diligence on human rights and on labor rights. And just to make that a little bit more concrete, because sometimes in these conversations we talk about ESG without defining what that is, but when we talk about supply chains, that means checking whether the people in that supply chain have the right to unionize, whether they are being informed and consulted when decisions are taken. It's about whether working conditions are safe, where there's no unpaid overtime or forced labor even, or child labor. It's about whether people are making a living wage. These are all very, very concrete things, and those are the things that companies, even if it's complicated and far away, need to go after and need to check. And that is not the only thing. Then, if turns out that no, there are problems, there is forced labor, or people aren't being paid their wages. Think about Qatar, for instance, and the building of the World Cup stadiums there. There's a lot of people still waiting for their wages, whose passports are gone. Situations like that, I mean, they require addressing. They also require access to justice for those who have been done wrong. And I think in terms of access to justice, that also means that the huge companies that talk a big game about finding this important need to not then throw millions of dollars at winning court cases and keeping this sort of imbalance of power there. So it's about doing your due diligence very seriously, I think it's also about breaking through silos in companies. And that last thing I said about, access to justice and then not having your legal team in your company, you go and try to destroy a local community in court cases, while actually the C-suite is saying, oh, we find this very important. That's hugely important, I think. And what I hear often on due diligence is that, I think also that the Business Roundtable in the US said at some point, businesses need to all have a purpose, and that's great, but then where did that end up in practice? Well, people in compliance are saying, we think we have something to do with it, but we're not sure, and people in purchasing are saying that, and then there's the PR department, and the PR department say, well, we need to make a brochure about this, but what is needed, I suppose, is to actually walk the walk and making sure that if there's such a purpose statement, or that it permeates in all levels of the company, and that the different parts of the company aren't fighting each other. I also say that because I still, and I apologize, it's also to spice things up a little bit, but I do wonder, the things that you just said on Apple, I want to believe those, and I do believe them because I know that there's a lot happening in big companies. But I also wonder, how does that story about recycling, for instance, how does it sit with the stories that I read about Apple slowing down my phone on purpose so that I need to buy a new one, for instance? Is that people within Apple not talking to each other? How does that happen?
Sure, if you'd like
Yes.
to respond, please.
Well, I want to address something regarding labor rights and listening to the voice of people in the supply chain, which we entirely agree with. Part of when we conduct supplier assessments is, and probably one of the most critical parts is ensuring that individuals who are at that facility are able to also give feedback. And this is a very critical part of our program. Last year, I think we heard directly from, I think, over 350,000 people in the supply chain. And there's a number of ways and mechanisms we do that. Sometimes it's grievance mechanisms, sometimes it's anonymous reporting or hotlines, sometimes it's worker surveys, and sometimes it's directly interviewing workers in their native languages. But I think that the flip side of that is that you have to really ensure that anti-retaliation provisions are equally as enforceable in your supplier code. So, for example, in our supplier code, sort of the most serious infraction is something we would call a core violation. Mm-hmm. So you might have a core violation for a number of the human rights issues that have been mentioned through the course of the last 2 days. A core violation would also be retaliating against a worker who participates in an assessment. And so those things go really tied together. For us, the way we're organized is, as I mentioned, I'm in our global operations group, so we're very tied in with all of our teams. And if there's a core violation of our supplier code, a supplier is immediately suspended. There is communication with the CEO of that supplier, and the supplier is unable to receive new business or new business expansion until the problem is corrected. Yeah. And again, if the problem is not corrected, it may lead up to termination. Heretofore, we have removed over 50 manufacturing suppliers in the supply chain, and I think some were about 170, and I might be getting my data not exactly right, smelters and refiners in the supply chain. And so accountability has to be a key part as well.
Terrific. Well, we're going to open it up to questions now. I have an iPad that is receiving your questions as we speak, so please do enter them here. And then we'll also do a bit of a roaming mic. But why don't I just start with a question that is receiving some of the votes on the app. And it might be good for both Claire and Andia. How do we ensure increasing international legislation does not push more vulnerable workers, such as migrants, into informal work, especially in the global south? So I don't know from your understanding of the legislation, and then Andia from the work you're doing with your investee companies themselves.
The responsibility of the companies under the legislation goes beyond the borders of the jurisdiction in which the company is headquartered, and that is really the due diligence that we've already been hearing about. It goes to understanding the impact of supplier codes, how they are respected, how they are implemented, and in many cases that may mean going beyond minimum local law requirements.
And Andy, what are you seeing where you're based?
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of enthusiasm around supporting social enterprises, early stage enterprises, and making that count for unrepresented groups, of which refugees, Africa, by the way, is the biggest home to refugee. My country, Kenya, was surrounded by war-torn countries that actually live in our country. So it's a less political aspect there than it is here. But what it is that we want the refugees to have businesses, and those businesses need to be sustainable. And I think one of the hardest ways and most difficult ways of getting funding is getting investors to back early growth stage businesses that are social enterprises from the beginning. We do a lot of work around this because we believe if everybody starts on the right foot from the beginning, you don't have to adjust and change culture and change your policies when you're a very big company. So I would just encourage a lot more investment within the entrepreneurial environment. I would also encourage a lot of investment in terms of youth. There's a lot of young people, they're hungry, people are sort of graduating from university and they don't have a job to go to. So, of course, with the social media, they will look to go abroad, even if it means they have to be a stowaway. So what we're saying is we need to create a very vibrant market within our home countries, and that can be supported through investment, and that's why I'm encouraging a lot of investors to be really responsible with who they allocate the capital to and ask the right questions in terms of what is the anticipated impact outcomes from that.
Terrific. Why don't we take a few questions from the audience? We'll sort of batch them up, and then panelists, please feel free to answer whichever really speak to you. So. Sure, there's someone back there with their hand up. Yes.
Hi, thank you for the panel. And Lara and Ashley, also thank you for participating in a controversial conversation, because actually it's very necessary, I think. My question, Ashley, is I'd like to, I don't know what is information that can be public, but what is your department or team budget versus the team with the biggest budget in Apple?
We'll take a few more, and then, yes.
Hi, I'm Erica George. I'm a law professor and also wanted to echo the thanks for this panel and particularly the candid conversation about questions. My question also is for you, Ashley. You mentioned having a grievance mechanism, and Laura talked about having access to remedy. You may or may not be aware that there is a case pending against Apple and others in Washington, D.C. It'll be heard in December on labor rights violations in the cobalt supply chain. So thinking about how renewable energies, rare earth minerals are impacting local labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I know Apple has been a leader after the legislation that required reporting. It's not clear to me if that's still in place, what you were doing, if any of the grievances came from that region, and how those were resolved. Are those within house in Apple? Are they in courts? What are you doing to, or what is the company doing to leverage the access that it has to change conditions? And are you in conversation with your legal department about these?
Any others that are, okay, we'll do one more, and then I'll also throw in some from the Q&A.
Thanks everyone. My name is Katie Chakraborty. I work at Oxfam GB. I really liked your characterization, Laura, of the, that question companies need to be honest about. Do we make iPads or do we do ESG? I think there's actually a third, which is regardless of what we make, do we make a lot of profit? That profit maximization regardless of what we say we do on the tin, is an increasing driver of a lot of companies. And I wanted to ask about the role of the legal frameworks around shareholder primacy, the legal frameworks around fiduciary duty of shareholders, and the responsibilities of investments for profit maximization, and what role that plays in allowing either making good products that don't have inbuilt obsolescence, which I think you're also talking to, but also ESG as well.
Great. And I'll just throw in a few more from the app here, and then maybe that can also form the final word, given we're approaching time. So a few more from the app. Two that are rather related. One is, how can we create more spaces to enable dialogue like this, where investors and lawyers and legislators and companies are all having these hard and difficult conversations? In particular, how can we bring young voices into that? And there's a second question which is related, which is, where do you all see the role of young people in particular to help drive this agenda? And then there's one final question, which is, can ESG really deliver against the magnitude of the changes we need, particularly given the speech we just heard prior to our panel about the urgency to act and the scale upon which we need to act? So lots of rich content, and perhaps we'll allow each of you just to comment on any one of those as we round out our final 5 minutes. India, would you like to start?
I think I'll pick the one about young voices.
Yes.
I think we need to get, young people actually lack agency. A lot of them are speaking their mind on social media, but it's very fragmented. And what we do with the Gresham Michelle Trust is that we build networks. And we've been good at building networks for women, but we're actually now starting an adolescent movement network, so that you can get people a place that we can get them to engage on the situations that are affecting them. A lot of people look at Africa and they see one big continent. It's a very diverse continent in terms of ethnicity, in terms of language, in terms of culture, but it's also a playing ground for a lot of bad behavior by international companies as well, combined with local companies knowing that even if there's a legislation, there's corruption. And I think what I'm trying to say is that investors, we have the power to basically change that by not only focusing on the return, but basically looking at what other aspects can we measure success. And I think youth engagement is a big one that we can do, and I feel like they can certainly be included into this ESG conversation.
Terrific. Ashley, any
yes.
final
so
words?
I'll take them quickly, and I'm probably forgetting the order. In terms of internal budgets, it's not something we would talk about publicly. What I will say is the question I get the most from our leadership is, this is really important work. How can we do it faster and at greater scale quickly? Because the climate cannot wait. Secondly, I think I might have said this in the beginning, but we actually just think it's a false dichotomy in terms of businesses needing to make a choice between doing well from a business perspective and doing the right thing for people and the planet. Thirdly, cobalt. I'm not on our legal team, so I can't speak to any lawsuit. What I can tell you is, from the operations level, we have a very, very strict responsible materials standard. It's online, so you're welcome to review it, and we're always happy, along with our whole supplier code of conduct, always to receive feedback. We review our standards every year, we heighten them every year, and we partially do that through engagements like this. With cobalt, cobalt is not a regulated material, so we are actually not compelled to publish our cobalt refiner list. That is tantalum, tungsten, and gold. We will be publishing our cobalt refiner list. I think this is our 6th or 7th year. So we have been doing it for some time. We have very much been leaders in the responsible material space, including cobalt. We partner with a lot of organizations in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in particular, which has the world's majority supply of cobalt. Again, we are driving our recycling goals very hard. So we seek to end our reliance on mining finite materials or using mined finite materials from the earth. In the meantime, we will continue to responsibly source primary materials. We sit on organizations like the Public-Private Alliance for the Responsible Minerals Trade, which is with the US government, some governments in the ICGLR region, NGOs. That is one way we look to ensure that standards are being met at that level of the supply chain. I think you asked specifically about grievance. So grievance is interesting. I know I'm taking too much time, I'll stop. Grievance is interesting at that level of supply chain. It's different than at a manufacturing site. So at that level of the supply chain, what we have done is there are certain industry certification schemes. We have supported a whistleblowing mechanism. So communities living around mine site level are able to raise those grievances. I think that was everything.
Great.
And I just want to say that we don't think this is a difficult topic. I mean, driving labor, human rights, environmental safeguard standards through a supply chain is what we're here to do. So I appreciate, I appreciate what you're saying, but we are always happy to talk about this.
Great.
Planned obsolescence was still a question from the audience.
I'm sorry. Our products are built for durability, and that includes all the way through end of life. I think that's the quickest answer to that because I see we're out of time.
We are.
I don't want to take the last words from the panel.
Claire and Lauren, I'll look to our overall moderators to keep us on track. But Claire and Lara, any final comments?
Just really briefly, I think it's essential to have multi-stakeholder engagement and conversations, and that's within an organization, making sure that different functions are communicating across a sector, making sure that you have use leverage within a sector to impact change, and cross-sector to learn from other sectors as well. And that dialogue and communication from different disciplines, different functions in those three different spaces is essential to move the dialogue forward.
Mm-hmm. And Lara?
Yeah, final thoughts and an answer to the Oxfam lady in the audience. We need qualitative growth over quantitative growth. We need to move away from short-termism and to encourage long-termism by legislation. And what that means too is on fiduciary duties, for instance, not saying that a company's duty is solely to its shareholders. And it's insane, I think, that there's still legislation out there that says that. Well, at the same time, we have the Green Deal and we have climate change to deal with, and we have the importance of ESG that we also subscribe to. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done there. At the same time, I think that we need to be careful with not putting the cart in front of the horse. And what I mean with that is that I do feel for business sometimes in that I think that there's a lot that needs to be done. And because policymakers have been slow on making legislation that is future-proof on climate change, on the huge inequality gap in the world, on the divide between rich and poor, on a lot of these things we see playing out around us now to do with authoritarian regimes and the war. I mean, what we need is leadership on those, and we need legislation to match it. And because it's frustrating that leadership isn't there yet, especially on climate change, I think we're trying to find other ways of still reaching our goals. And I think what that means is that sometimes companies are being asked to do things that legislators and that governments haven't done themselves yet, but where there is an expectation that is palpable from consumers and from citizens. And that, I think, is difficult to grapple with, and I think that it's very, very important when it comes to due diligence, when it comes to respect, for all the things we talked about, but I also definitely for myself and for those in government see a duty there.
Terrific. Well, everyone, please join me in thanking each of our panelists for just a terrific conversation. Thank you, everyone.